Hi everyone, my name is Doug Bosch. I am Professor of Foundations here at Rhode Island College, and I'm currently serving as the Department Chair. I've been at RIC since 2001. The work I put in the 3D faculty show this year are works that are referencing early 19th century scientific instruments that are based on early pioneering experiments with electromagnetism.
Could you talk a little bit about how you got interested in sort of combining art and science in the first place?
That's actually a hard one to answer because I've been doing it for so long. I don't remember when it started, but even going back to my grad school days, I was always had an interest in the look of early scientific instruments. And even in grad school, I would go to some of the lectures in the science department. I just found that the concepts that they discussed and examined had a lot of parallel to the arts, with a combination between the aesthetic of the way scientific devices look and the way science asks deep and probing questions, also quite similar to the arts.
So you've been working on this since grad school. What has sort of evolved with the way that you've started to look at art and science? How is your work different now than it was, quite a few years back?
So I think for a couple of decades, my work tried to just flirt with science, but more recently, I have tried to engage more directly the actual history of science, and by referencing specific scientists by name or certain series of experiments by their category. For example, both of these sculptures are influenced by the French physicist Ampère, and looking at his early examples of experimenting with electrical signals and electrostatic. So when I'm able to talk about these, I can not only talk about the aesthetics of the work, but a little bit about making reference to the scientists themselves. Trying to make the connection more direct and less vague.
How much archival research goes into sort of finding your source material then?
Countless hours, but they're wonderfully spent. I couldn't even tell you how many hours I spend researching various archives of museums of science around the world. I get lost in the research, and there are moments when I'm looking at some specific artistic or scientific instruments that I completely forget that they are scientific instruments. They just suddenly start to look like sculptures, and I know at that moment that I'm already starting to brainstorm about what I want to start building next.
Could you talk a little bit about this first sculpture here? I know it's titled After Nobili, with a series of complicated numbers afterwards. What do those numbers reference?
Those numbers actually simply are the date, because this is one, I think, of 8 in this series, so the date just marks when in the series it was made. But in this series, you'll see often in these historical instruments that the business end of the demonstration device, where the actual magic or the activity took place, was often marked by a noticeably red paint or some other device, so that the viewing audience would know where to focus their attention to watch, typically for just a little spark. So most of these little devices here mimic some of those early electromagnetic experiments where the red mark would draw the viewer's attention to where the spark would actually jump from one point to another.
And could you talk a little bit about the display method? Like, why did you choose to include it in a glass display box?
As I research these instruments, typically looking at them either online or physically in a museum, they typically are displayed in a very formal way, often with the parts carefully separated so that you can see where one device ends and another begins. And then also because the parts tend to be very fragile and very small, they're under glass cases to protect them. So I'm just trying to invoke the same kind of presentation device that you will find in a pretty typical museum of science.
Could we talk a little bit about this work over here? So why then did you choose not to include a glass display case for this work?
Well, again, you'll sometimes see this when you're in an actual museum of science, that not all of the devices are under case. And sometimes it is, for me personally, I developed such an affection for the way the dirt and sediment begins to settle on the actual instruments themselves. So here I'm inviting the dust of the room to actually begin collecting on the device. But also I recognize that the glass case is also a divider that separates the viewer from the work. So I want to make sure that I don't always present the work that way. That I want to make some of it more accessible. And to also play up the fact that it is fragile and it forces the viewer to kind of have to behave themselves when they're standing in front of it. Yeah.
Do you start with a sketch, like a 2D sketch of the work, or do you start directly with playing with a 3D model?
I do both. So I typically will do several days of just drawing, for example, all of these little devices and variations on them, and I'll just fill pages with them. So I'll have those kind of as a blueprint to work from, but typically what I then will do in the case of this work is I will actually start building them, and then once I physically have them, I lay them out in front of me, and then it becomes sort of a choreography experiment or an arrangement where I'm deciding which ones kind of make sense together. And as I'm doing that process, the platform or the arena in which they might simultaneously live together starts to come into focus as a sculpture object.
And could you just talk a little bit about what you would like a viewer to be able to do if they could come into this physical gallery space? How would they best interact with these works?
Well, hopefully visually only, but I do try to tempt the viewer to want to touch. And it isn't so fragile that it couldn't withstand that, but I suppose most people would feel too inhibited. But I do hope that with this one in particular, because the glass case is not there, that they can get as close to the piece as possible and really get to appreciate that in some cases, even their breath will start to move some of the pieces a little bit. And also, I would hope that being able to see the piece in person, that it almost implies that underneath the board, as if this were a circuit board, that underneath there are electrical connections, that there is a little sense of, or a sense of a little bit of danger, that these pieces might actually hold a little bit of an electrical charge. So kind of putting the viewer a little, trying to catch them off guard a little bit that way too.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Doug.
You're welcome. I wish you guys could see it in person.